Welcome back. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and this is the Phoibos Apollo, one of the more interesting and uniquely designed watches I've seen come out of Phoibos, which is really saying something because they have some pretty interesting and unique designs. And I'm not just talking about the dial design, but the watch itself is completely comprised of aerospace-grade titanium, and that also includes an extra anti-scratch resistant coating. But the design itself is still pretty unique. Now, when I look at this watch, I see sort of this combination of a Titanium SKX case with a white dial Helm Komodo I looked at a while ago, and the indices from that M-Force I unboxed not too long ago, which is a pretty odd combination, and even then, I have no idea where they got this handset. So this is definitely an odd little bugger, and it's not going to be for everyone, especially those that like more traditional dive watches. But if you do like something a little bit different, then stay tuned as we check this thing out. But before we do that, I do need to tell you that this watch was given to the channel by Phoibos, and they're not asking for it back, hence that promotional tag at the beginning. Now, that said, let's dive in and see what this Space Kraken's all about. As far as divers go, most of the specs on the Apollo are going to be fairly standard. 41mm width, 48mm lug-to-lug, and a total thickness of 12.7. And I should probably point out that they actually list the width at being 42mm wide. Yet, when I measure it from the 9 to the 3, it only comes out at 41, and the bezel itself is only 41.5. So it is a little bit smaller than they say it is, and that's a good thing. You also have a Seiko NH35A movement, 200 meters of water resistance, and a 22mm lug width, as well as a flat sapphire with 3 layers of AR coating, so all fairly standard these days. However, where the Apollo really shines is in the materials used and this really out-of-this-world design on the dial. The Apollo is made out of titanium, and it's also treated with an extra ultra-hex anti-scratch resistant coating. And that makes this thing very lightweight for its size, where with its bracelet it's only about 125 grams. And when Phoibos says this case is made out of titanium, they mean everything here is made out of titanium. The bracelet, the case back, the crown, and the bezel. They even went so far to make the bezel insert out of titanium and then put a DLC coating on top of it. Which to me is actually fairly impressive. They could have easily used aluminum and no one would have noticed. The overall case shape of the Apollo is very SKX-like to me, so I think that is where they got their inspiration from. It may be a tad smaller and much more angular, as there's no curvy sidewall here or really any polished surface whatsoever. Everywhere you look on the Apollo, it has a nice brushed titanium finish, so this one is all tooly and all business all the time. Except for the case back, where you have this little guy here doing whatever it is he's doing, maybe a bad Buzz Lightyear impression. Now, I believe this is the first Phoibos I've seen that doesn't have their Octopus Kraken logo on the back. And it may be the first one I've seen in a while where it doesn't have a deeply embossed case back. Which I'm guessing the reason for that is that titanium is a little harder to work with, so they decided to do this laser etching here. But why they went with this little guy, I have no idea. It's a little weird and a little goofy in my opinion. And I think the bigger problem is that there's nothing really here connecting to the brand at all. So I think they should have just lasered on their logo, or if they did want something a little bit cartoony, then maybe they could have used this guy but added a couple extra set of hands, just to make it seem like it's an octopus in a spacesuit. Honestly, I don't know. It is the case back, so at least you're not really looking at it, but there are a lot of things they could have done that I think would have worked better. Anyway, let's go back to the front of the case, and sitting at the right, down at the 4 o'clock position, you do have a signed screw-down crown. And it's here where you do get a glimpse of that Phoibos logo. Now the crown is a nice size, and it does have good knurling. So even with those angular crown guards, I thought it was always very easy to get a hold of and use. Although my only real nitpick here is that the finishing is a little bit different than that of the case, so it stands out just a tad. However, the DLC coated bezel, and especially this version with the light blue Arabics, I think blends in very nicely into the design. It is titanium, so it feels a little bit different as you rotate it, but the action here is perfect. It's 120 click, unidirectional, and 0 backplay, with a great tactile and audible click as you rotate it. That's how a bezel really should be done. Whereas the dial design is something that I don't think has ever been done before. And to their credit, Phoibos has pulled out all the stops with the Apollo, creating 6 different colorways, most of which have a very different feel from the other. At first glance, this white dial version was easily my favorite. I think it has a very clean and crisp look to it, where the light blue coloring catches your eye and just brings focus to the complex design. So this is the one that I requested, and I'm actually very happy that Phoibos sent it. But there is a trade-off with this colorway that we'll talk about in a bit. The foundation of the design is a matte textured dial in a sandwich configuration, which I think you can clearly see with the cardinal indices at the 12, 6, and 9, where it has this very angular U or maybe horseshoe shape to it that is cut into the upper layer of the dial, showing off a light blue coloring underneath. However, moving to the other indices, that's where things get a little different, where you still have this U shape in that light blue, but it is a little bit more simplified. Although here it's painted on top of the dial with a thick application of superluminova rather than being a cutout. Although there's still a sandwich section of the dial here with these lesser indices. And for that, you just have to look a little bit lower to the black pentagon, which is kind of acting as a counterweight to that smaller U. And this is something that I think is very interesting. I've seen a lot of sandwich dials, but I've never seen one that uses 2 different colors on the lower dial. Now, the design of the indices is a little odd, that's pretty obvious, but I think it works really well. The larger cardinal points create this nice crosshair, while the smaller ones have that black point leading inward. And all of that creates a very nice effect that automatically guides your eyes right to the center of the dial, right to this very unusual and odd-looking handset. Looking into this a little bit more, Phoibos says that this handset is supposed to represent space exploration and the rockets that are used. And I can kind of see that, and especially with the minute hand. But for me, with this hour hand, while it still does look like a rocket, I think it looks more like a big black shovel, where you have this blue-tipped spade and a very black handle. Now, either way you look at it, I think it's a very interesting and unique handset, and one that is particularly well done, with lengths that are just about perfect. The skeletonized minute hand is also very cool, but I think it would have been better if it wasn't skeletonized, as at that point there would be more contrast here helping it stand out. Also note that the date window is at the 3. Now personally I would have preferred it if it was at the 6, just for more symmetry, but it does have a nice painted frame on it in the same light blue superluminova, which will help it blend in a bit. Just beyond that, we also have a slightly raised chaptering that is also painted with the matching blue and black superluminova. So if you haven't realized it yet, realize that almost every aspect of this dial is going to glow when the lights go out. The one exception to that is going to be the Phoibos logo just below the 12. Now, at this point, I think everyone knows how they feel about the Phoibos logo, so I'm not even going to get into that. But this particular version does appear to be applied to the dial, so there is a very slight amount of depth to it. And I think the black also looks particularly good against the white dial. However, if there was any watch that Phoibos was going to loom up the logo, this should have been it. So not really a nitpick at all, but I think there's a missed opportunity here. As far as the actual dial design goes, well, at first glance I think it does look a bit odd and chaotic. Kind of like someone was trying to do a Space Invaders or Galaga themed watch, and then maybe got lost along the way. But once you start to really look at it, and I think realize how everything is laid out, you realize that it's not that complicated, and that the light blue and black components offer a good amount of contrast against the polar white dial. Plus, between the sandwich sections, the painted indices, and the raised chapter ring, there is a surprising amount of depth here for a watch with a sandwich dial. It's also very visually interesting, yet I think this white dial in particular still has a rather clean feel to it, at least relatively speaking. Now it's still a bit odd, there's no getting around that, and I think that is going to turn off a fair amount of people. Yet I think others are going to be attracted and love this off-the-wall design. People always say they want something different and they're tired of the same old homages. Well, here you go. Phoibos has created something very unique with a very solid build quality. Anyway, let's move on to the Lume. And for the most part, I think Phoibos did a fantastic job when it comes to integrating the Lume into the design. I've never seen anything quite like this, as everything just vibrantly comes to life. It's kind of bonkers and crazy looking, but in a good way. I love the dual color design here, as well as how everything is initially nice and bright. Which really isn't surprising when you realize that Phoibos used 15 layers of Swiss superluminova here. However, more so than any other watch I've looked at, the lume performance here is going to vary wildly with each colorway. And that's simply because Phoibos took the extra step of really personalizing each colorway with a different colored set of Superluminova. And as I've seen in the past, each colored version of Superluminova does perform differently. Now, to Phoibos' credit, they do a great job on their product page of saying what is where with each colorway. So, for example, with this gray version, they say it's a combination of light orange and BGW9, whereas the version I have is light blue with black Superluminova. And with this one, they even have a little bit of a warning saying that the black doesn't perform as well as BGW9 or C3. So just from my prior experiences, I know that this one isn't going to be the best Apollo when it comes to lume. And if you want to make sure that you get the best version when it comes to lume, then pay attention to the product pages and look for ones that specifically have BGW9 or C3 Superluminova. Now, as far as this version is concerned, it's actually not that bad. As you would expect, the black elements on the dial do fade out rather quickly, but the rest of it does hang in there for a bit. The only real disappointing aspect I saw here is that skeletonized minute hand with its very small tip does fade out a bit before the hour hand. So this isn't going to be one that's going to last you throughout the night, but overall I'd say the lume is okay, maybe even good. But as you saw, it didn't quite keep up with a Seiko Turtle, so it's definitely not Seiko good. Although I think the versions with C3 and BGW9 would give that Seiko a run for its money. Now, as for the movement, we are looking at your standard Seiko NH35A, which is really the workhorse of the affordable watch. This is a little on the higher end for where some people like to see this movement, but I think it's perfectly fine here, and rather fitting for a pure tool watch such as this. Now, overall, I think the Apollo is great, but if there is one area that I have an issue with, it's going to be the bracelet. It has the same titanium as well as the same Ultra Hex scratch resistant coating as the case. You have solid links, screwed in links, and a pretty good, mostly milled clasp. The links are also fully articulating in an H-link style bracelet format, and I think that really adds to the comfort as it conforms around your wrist. So the bracelet is still pretty good, but my issue is that it doesn't taper at all. It starts out at 22mm and stays 22 throughout the bracelet to the clasp. And that also leads to a fairly wide clasp sitting on the back of your wrist. It's not bad, but just a little bit of a taper here would have been nice. The other issue with the bracelet is that where it's fitted, the spring bar is very close to the case. Basically to the point that you're not going to be able to use any aftermarket straps without a curved or bent spring bar. And that's what I did here to use these other straps. So you can still use other straps, but there is a little bit of an extra step to it. Now, despite that 22mm clasp, the watch itself is very comfortable to wear. A 48mm lug-to-lug has always been just about perfect for my wrist, so here it sits nice and squarely right where it needs to. Plus, it's incredibly lightweight thanks to that titanium. Even with the bracelet on, it's barely noticeable. Yet take the bracelet off and put on something like a NATO, and you can easily forget you're wearing it. As far as value goes, the MSRP for the Apollo is $400, but there are a number of 10% discount codes out there available, including one for this channel, which brings it down to $360, and for that, I think is pretty good. I know that's still on the higher end for some people when it comes to a watch with a Seiko NH35, but do remember that this is a full titanium watch with a scratch-resistant coating, not to mention a very unique and original design. For comparison, I think the best watch to look at might be the RZE Endeavor. Now, that watch is also fully titanium, and I do think it has a better bracelet, but it's also $100 more. You could also check out the Zelos Mako titanium line, if you can actually find one. Now, even at MSRP, those are a bit more, but they do come with a better movement. However, when it comes to a complete and rather affordable package, I think Phoibos did a great job here with the Apollo. This watch is a great example of what I like about Phoibos, as well as a few other micro brands out there. The ones that aren't afraid to do something different, something rather strange that a lot of people would look at and think is kind of an oddball. They realize that not everyone is going to like everything, and trying to design a watch that everyone will like oftentimes leads to something that feels kind of generic. Whereas this is completely unique. There's a few characteristics that remind me of other watches, but I can't think of anything that looks quite like this, let alone in titanium. Now, there are a few issues with it, and for me, I think it's all kind of in the bracelet. I wish they'd really tapered it, as well as made it so that you didn't necessarily have to have the bracelet on it. Or you can change it out, you just need curved spring bars. But other than that, it's really well done, and it's becoming one of my more favorite Phoibi. So like a lot of their other watches, just kind of go off your gut instincts on whether or not you like the design. If you look at something like this and think it's really cool, you'll like it. If you look at it and think it's just odd, probably best to move on and look at something else. For me, I think it's obvious at this point that I do like it, and it's going to stick around for a while. And part of that is because I've always been a sucker for titanium. And this, with the scratch-resistant coating, kind of gives you all the benefits without the drawbacks of titanium. But the real question is, what do you guys think about the Phoibos Apollo? Do you like the design? Are you curious about it? Or you just think it's really strange? Let me know down below in a comment. And if there are any other interesting dive watches out there that you're thinking about, let me know that as well. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time. See you next time.